Welcome to the Analytics Engineering Podcast, featuring conversations with practitioners inventing the future of analytics engineering.
On this episode, we sit down with Sean Taylor, Chief Scientist at Motif Analytics, and Vijay Raji, founder and CEO of Statsig. They both previously worked at large, forward-thinking tech companies and saw the power of making experiments as a seamless part of product development. They share how big companies operationalize testing hypotheses and how small companies can also make experimentation a part of their practice. What I like about this episode is that even though these two have built careers in experimentation, we discuss it's not without its limitations. We all seem to agree you can't experiment your way from a horse to a car.
I love this because there's this world that exists at these large digital native technology companies and experiments inside of these environments, because the tooling has been built up to such a degree. Experiments maybe are not easy, but the rails on which you get to run them are so well traveled. And so there's a playbook and there's clear cultural norms around them. And it's just everything kind of leads you towards running experiments and doing this effectively. And I think for folks who have not existed in that environment, it's a little bit hard to imagine all of the different things that have to be working right in order to get this flywheel moving. And I think this is one of the better conversations I've ever had that kind of demystifies how this works and what all the different components are.
Totally. I think at scale, you have to really operationalize these things really, really well. Experiments being one of many such things that large companies, it's too expensive if there's too much friction involved. So you get to see the other side, which was fun for me because I've never worked at a FANG before, actually heard how much of a standard part of their product development process running experiments are. And it also gave me some hope too that even if you're not at a FANG company, you can still make experiments part of your day-to-day work. So this was a fun one. Without further ado, let's get into it. Okay, welcome. We're excited to have two guests on today, Sean and Vijay. We're going to talk a lot about experimentation, which is a topic near and dear to lots of people in the data community's heart. And it's going to be an exciting episode because they both have some actually shared experiences working at big tech companies and moving to actually founding companies in the space. So why don't we start off by Sean just giving a quick background on yourself, and then we'll hit Vijay.
Hi, I'm Sean. I'm really happy to be here. I guess my experimentation journey started in grad school. So I was a PhD student working on social science experiments. And then I kind of ended up at Facebook working on experimentation there for a few years. After that, I went to Lyft and worked on marketplace experimentation, very fun and different topic, lots of interesting challenges there. And then in the last few months, I just started a company called Motif Analytics, and we're sort of pre-experiment. How do you get the insights that help you decide what to run the experiments on in the first place? Love experiments. Really happy to talk about them today.
I'm Vijay Raji, founder, CEO of Statsig. We've been at it for about 19 months. And before founding Statsig, I spent about 10 years at Facebook. And then before that, 10 years at Microsoft. So two big, large tech companies, a decade each. And one of the things that I realized when I go into Facebook is the set of tooling that was available to us to build products extremely fast and experiment all the time, understand the impact of every effort that we put in, effort to build the products and ship it, and then impact on how it affects the users and then also the business. So that kind of gave me a unique perspective to understand how impactful experimentation is, so much so that I decided I'm going to go start my own company and build those tools. And that's what we're doing at Statsig. Excited to be here. Thanks for having us.
Before we get into the hard-hitting stuff, because this is a hard-hitting show, there was a news story that was out, I don't know, maybe 5 years ago about a Facebook experimentation, and it was social science, and I think that Facebook got in some trouble for this, and whatever. It made me think about it when, Sean, you were talking about being from social science, being in an academic profession, and then moving over to Facebook and working in experimentation. I'm just curious, how many of your peers came from an actual PhD background? How many of them shared this path that you were on? Because my guess is that given your path, experimentation and social science experimentation felt incredibly natural in this largest of all social observability platforms ever.
I remember when I first arrived at Facebook to start full time, it was right after the emotional contagion controversy. So that experiment was a paper published in a very well regarded scientific journal, and it was a very large experiment on many Facebook users, and it made their news feeds like less positive. Just sort of like people think of that as a harm. And when you run experiments, you have to consider risk of harm as a social scientist. And we were at the time very excited about Facebook's potential as this like large laboratory for studying humans. And I think that vision gradually became less realistic as, you're running a company and the mission of the company isn't to like learn things about the world for social scientists, but it's to like make it more successful and make the product safer and better for users. So gradually I started to pivot from social science questions to business questions. And that's kind of like where I've landed is we don't subject users to risk of harm under any circumstances, unless we're going to learn something that's going to make the product so much better for them that it's worth it. But yeah, it's a very interesting time to be there.
IRB?
IRB, yeah. That's
yeah,
right.
where you have to like get people to sign off on being a part of an experiment. Theoretically, if you were going to do a large scale experiment, you would have to like IRB all of these people that were participating in it.
Yeah, there's this huge loophole in people don't know this, but if a company runs the experiment for you as a professor, then you're not subject to like any real requirements for IRB. It's like, the company decided to do this, so the responsibility is out of your hands. It's really quite a loophole.
Very interesting.
I can't be the only one. What is IRB?
It's an institutional review board. It's part of a university that sort of decides whether an experiment that you propose is like ethical to run. And so like, it's not your decision about whether the experiment can be run or not. So there is this kind of like, you delegate the decision about the ethics of your experiment to them in some ways. But if you run an experiment cooperating with the business, it's sort of like, all they did was hand you data. You didn't actually design and run the experiment, which is very not true, actually.
Thanks for taking a side journey there. My guess is that you are by no means alone in the academic bent of your background before coming to Facebook. Is that fair?
Oh, there's so many political scientists, economists, and they, when you're a social scientist, running experiments with real human subjects is one of the hardest things to do, but also the thing where you learn the most. So everyone's really excited about online platforms as a way to do that. But navigating these issues is a little bit challenging. So like, how do you do running experiments on users is costly to the business and to them. And so making sure that you kind of align the experiment. If you want to find something out about the world, it also should probably benefit the users of your platform in some way. So how do you find that kind of like sweet spot where so LinkedIn just published a study about how people use their weak ties, additional weak ties to like find jobs. And that's actually kind of like LinkedIn's business, right? It might be like helping people find jobs. So you can justify studying that social science question from a business perspective too.
Totally.
Some of the emotional contagion at Facebook probably less justified.
That's what I find really interesting because like really large companies like Microsoft, Facebook, Lyft, they have budgets where it actually can pay off for them to run big experiments on large user bases. There's clear ROI to them. They can also afford to hire lots of PhDs that aren't inexpensive to employ. I think one of the things I'm really curious about is like, what does experimentation actually look like at these large organizations? I've never worked at a FANG company, so you hear a lot like, oh, this is done really well, or this is the right way to do it. These are the best practices at scale, and that's often not really achievable for lots of startups or smaller stage companies for a number of reasons, either resources or doesn't make sense from an ROI perspective, but help demystify what was the actual practice and philosophy around experimentation at these largest companies. And Vijay, I'd love to maybe start with you.
What we're talking about is product experimentation here. And a lot of times when we talk to people, they bring up the statistical power as one of the things that they're worried about. And you need to have large amounts of people or samples in order to run experiments successfully. And generally what we have found out is like, statistical power is a combination of a few different factors. And one of the biggest factors is your minimum detectable effect, which is how big of the change you're looking for. And when you're small companies, you're looking for larger changes. When you're early in your journey, you're looking for larger changes. And that actually has a bigger impact on your statistical power. And so this is a myth that I want to address, take this opportunity, because you don't need large sample sizes to actually run effective experiments on the product.
You just have to be willing to take big swings, like going for big changes.
Yeah. I mean, if you're looking for 0.1, 0.01% improvements in a particular metric, yeah, you definitely need like hundreds of thousands or maybe even millions of samples. But most companies that we work with, we're always looking for like 5, 10% wins, for which you don't need that many samples. And it's an important element that, we've been trying to address whenever we talk to people with that concern. In terms of like experiments themselves, like, I worked at Facebook, and I've seen it firsthand. A lot of this kind of like comes down to the culture. In fact, like some of these are actually self-fulfilling because the tools themselves shape the culture. I'll explain. When you have the right tooling, when you have the ability to like safeguard the user experience, it actually empowers people, engineers and product managers to come up with newer ideas. And these ideas doesn't have to be totally vetted in conference rooms. You don't have to have like this debate. Sometimes it's actually much easier to just build it and put it out there and measure the impact of your change than to like just debate it in conference rooms, right? And so what then happens is like people are willing to like be creative. They build out their ideas, and then we never block anyone from like, taking a very small sample size and then trying it out. And then so you roll it out very, very slowly and see if there's any impact to any of the metrics that you care about. And if your new change actually ends up affecting some core metric negatively, then you shut down the experiment. It does a few things. One is it makes distributed decision-making much easier. So there are teams that actually trust each other's experiment results because they all trust the tool and the outcome of the tool. And thereby, decision-making is happening everywhere and everybody trusts it. Secondly, it actually enables teams to be autonomous and move fast. And they also have kind of like I have the creative outlet to go think about something new, try it out and validate it. And I don't have to go through this large process. Then one of the other things that I've also noticed is like the data scientists, it's hard enough to get good data scientists in companies. And then they don't like to subject themselves to like going and debugging or diagnosing past experiments. So when the tooling can do most of that heavy lift, then they're focused on like more creative work, more forward-looking product directions. And so I thought those are all like some of the downstream effects of like measuring every product change that you make.
It's almost more of a culture than it is a technology. It's like a technology that enables a particular culture. And as we're certainly, as a company, DBT Labs is dramatically smaller than Facebook, but we're starting to get bigger such that I truly, like when you say distributed decision-making, I'm just like, oh my gosh, the holy grail. Like it's what every kind of scaling company wants. I'm curious. I totally understand the trust in the decisions, and I understand to a certain extent the ability to kind of run your own experiments. But we were talking about the IRB before. It's not just did the metrics work, but there's also an element of like not anyone can push out an experiment into production without any review, right? Like so there has to be some kind of other eyes on this thing, don't there?
Usually it's like, I'm not saying any rogue engineer can do whatever they want. It's more like a product team coming up with an idea usually. And then instead of one large thing that you're like, okay, I'm going to spend months building it, and then I'm going to create an A/B test and I'm going to verify if whatever my hypothesis is valid. You just break it down into so many smaller chunks. And it's like, instead of this one large change that you're pushing and hoping, God, it works, you're now trying 15, 20 different granular things. And so that's, I think, obviously there are checks and balances in place to like, not have anyone just randomly ship any code. This is what I'm talking about is more of like how granular can you get? When you start measuring everything, how frequently would you make those decisions?
I think you also have to have a culture of being okay to shut down work that you've spent several months building and the numbers aren't showing the results you're hoping for. That's a big cultural acceptance from a company saying, hey, we're okay with spending many, many months of many, many engineers' time and it not paying off.
Yeah, it is, the interesting bit about like personal attachment to the code you wrote is pretty crazy. Like when data tells you, it's so much easier to like, okay, I'm going to drop this line of thinking and I'm going to restart something versus somebody else telling you. And so I noticed that as one of those downstream cultural effects of like people don't get attached to the code or product you build, and actually rely on data, which is fascinating, which is really cool.
It is like one of the dirty little secrets of experimentation that like a very small fraction of experiments are successful. So you think of this like platonic ideal, like I tested my thing and we got this great result and now I get to get credit for making this big impact. But I think it's like 1 in 10, 1 in 6 experiments are like shippable according to whatever launch criteria that you have. At least that's my experience at Facebook. Which means that most engineers who build a change and spend all this time building it, like end up at an experiment review meeting where they're being told that we're not going to ship what you did. And we have a very good reason for doing so because it either made the experience worse or we didn't see benefits from it. That can be quite frustrating for people. I think this idealized attitude of like, oh, it's fine. I'm going to like do what the experimentation platform says isn't really exactly true because people get frustrated about that. Like they put a lot of time and effort. And in particular, designers, I think, often have sort of like good reasons for changing things that don't improve metrics necessarily, and maybe even make metrics worse, but there's like a philosophy to it that isn't encoded in the metrics entirely. And so like you get into these debates a lot about whether the experiment truly reflects what you're really trying to do or not.
You said experimentation review. I'm super curious. Like that to me makes a lot of sense. Yeah, you like built the thing, you're testing the metrics, and now you have to pull from someone who knows how to read the results to help understand like was that effective or not. But what are the like minimal set of ingredients needed for a successful experiment? What does that look like?
For a review?
No, a successful experiment from like start to finish. What does it look like?
I think there's often a good social process is to have a pre-review where you describe to your team and any other, people affected what you're planning to test. And then you run the experiment and then a post-review where you review like what you learned from the test and like what decision there is to be made. Often the decision is to like run another test. And those are good meetings to have a lot of people and have a lot of stakeholders in because they want to understand what other people are doing. At Lyft, marketplace experiments could like conflict with one another in ways that could create problems. So having those meetings is a good way to like make, you picture it as being distributed and everybody can make independent changes, but that's not really true. They can interact with one another in adverse ways. And then in the review meeting, you're trying to kind of like come to a decision consensus as an organization. And that's a very political process actually, because like there's some skin in the game for the people who built the new changes. People have their pet projects or they're excited or they want to continue a line of work. And that meeting is like, can be really challenging to get through with a successful decision.
Can we talk about the words that you just said, skin in the game? I think that this is something that gets talked about in our academic culture, where you would like it to be true that scientists pursue the truth, whether it is positive or negative result in a particular experiment. But in fact, generally papers get written about positive results and careers get made on top of those papers being published. Do promo packets include successful experiments but not failed experiments? Like, are there behavioral rails that like make people want to skew towards calling things a success?
Yeah, I think there's definitely an element of that. And we've seen that too. Like, look, we are all people and there's generally attachment. It's hard to like be totally clinical about that. But I think, Sean, you mentioned like, 1 in 10 experiments actually succeed. And in order to like find that one successful experiment, you do have to experiment a lot and try out various different things. At the end of the day, the tool is only going to give you data and inferences, and it's the product team's decision to decide. It's up to them to make the call whether you want to ship it or not, and that's based on some of these side effects that you may not even have expected, and you have to like rationalize that. You want to understand what that means, and then sometimes, we've shipped things even when the numbers say otherwise, because we believe that there's a bigger mountain on the other side. Once you cross this, there's something that is a global maxima that we're shooting for, and that's okay. And that's entirely up to the product team's decision. And that's, when that happens, you do need a larger buy-in, the experiment review, much more involved in stakeholders. When I see things just like are very friction-free and just moves smoothly over is when there's no debates like that. When there's like, small little changes that just have like the big impact, and then that gets entered into a promo packet, and then people get credit for that. But yeah, I think, but in general, my experience has been like 80% of the code, 80% of the product features generally don't work right out of the bat. And then there's also like, there's an element of hey, someone feels so strongly about this, so they're going to iterate on that feature until they exhaust all of the possibilities and then they give up. Or maybe they'll find the winning variant in one of those iterations. So, and all of those outcomes are possible. It's rarely black or white.
Yeah, I like that perspective that you always learn something from an experiment, even the failed ones. And often it's like, oh, there was just a bug in the implementation and we can fix that. So an experiment that isn't a success still contributes to your company being more successful a lot of the time. But I do think that like rewarding people only for the good wins and the ones that have positive metric wins is kind of a little bit pathological. And really what we should be rewarding is experimentation throughput. And I actually made this argument in one of my performance reviews one time. Was like, I ran like 20 experiments this half and only like one of them worked, but I ran 20 experiments. And actually that's a sign of a good process that we were able to like keep the queue of experiments like filled with ideas. And that means that like, okay, we got a little unlucky this half, but we have a good process. And so gearing too much on the outcome and not the process is kind of like one of the pathologies of like looking at only the metric wins. Because you're learning a lot by running experiments, and you're also sort of like, you can get on these unlucky streaks where you just don't happen to have a good idea for a little while, or maybe the users don't like what you're trying.
Hey, Julia, can I ask you a question for a second?
I already know what you're going to ask me.
So 1 in 20 experiments got
Yeah.
through. How would your team feel
Yeah.
if 95%, like we just couldn't function as a product and engineering organization
Yeah.
in that world? So I guess my question for you is like, what do you think is different about is it scale? Is it like we're a different type of software? Like super curious.
This is extremely important point to make, is that when I'm running like 20 experiments a half, it's usually configuration based experiments, not new engineering work. So a lot of Facebook experiment, people don't know this, are not like, move a button around or change the UI. It's actually just like numbers and a configuration that determine the behavior of the system. So when you have algorithmic systems like this, it's sort of like, how much weight should we put on certain factors in the ranking algorithm? Is a very large design space that you can export their experimentation. And it's like basically free to generate a new experimental condition because you just have to change a config file. And so that's a very different style of experimentation than most people are familiar with, but it also is probably one of the primary ways that a large algorithmic company like Lyft and Facebook are basically algorithms at the end of the day. Like the UI matters and you can make improvements through that, but how you rank newsfeed at Facebook, how you rank search at Google, like is the product in some ways. And so the configuration file is the design space. It's not the UI. And so you can run a lot of experiments very quickly in that setting.
Yeah. You have dynamic pricing. You have driving all of your revenue. I think the thought of my team building 20 experiments in a quarter is just insane to think about, because like we're always so resource constrained. And also if I had so much uncertainty about what we needed to build at this stage in the company, like it would be a problem. I want to quote you, Sean, from one of the articles that you wrote about experimentation. And this is you coming from a large background and being positive on experimentation. But you said a modification of the famous Henry Ford quote is, you can't A/B test your way from selling horses to selling cars. And a corollary, if you're testing a horse against a car, you definitely don't need an A/B test. So I think I find it fascinating because it's like we're talking here about incrementalism, and maybe that's not the right word, because changes to the algorithm for Lyft certainly drive lots of dollars of profit. But the idea of bringing a whole new product experience into the world isn't going to be experimented. Like you're not going to just figure out what to build from an experiment. You have to have other kind of intuition. Like, we have a big product bet at DBT Labs. Like we're spent a year building the semantic layer. Like we certainly involved customers and we had good market information into why this was important, but there's no amount of experiment data that would tell us this is going to be a success. Hopefully it will be. But what do you think? Do people over experiment here? Like, is it a risk of getting too incremental to get to a local maximum when really there's maybe a global maximum out there? How are experiments done wrong?
I have some thoughts on this. I'm very curious to hear BJ's, because it looks like he shipped a lot of interesting new products at Facebook. So he's probably got the sort of like global optimum idea in mind. But from my perspective, I do think experimentation does cause people to think a little bit locally, or like, what can we do cheaply in the next week or two that could get me like a 1% win that I can put on my performance review, is the kind of pathology that you can create from having experimentation culture. And you need to be aware of that. And to get to the big wins, the 10% wins, or the thing that doubles your growth, often you need to have a theory about that. And experimentation will never create a theory for you. It will give you like sort of like the effect of moving from one place to another place locally. But to get to another place in the landscape where it gets to the top of the mountain in the fitness landscape, you need to have a theory about that. And that comes from, your experience talking to your users and your understanding what they need. And an A/B test is probably not the right place to learn about whether that's what they want or not. I think, so this question of like, where do good test ideas come from, and is an important one. And I don't think tests themselves generate ideas about what to test besides just like fixing bugs and stuff like that. You need to have a theory of your users and what they want. And so I think that's important. And sometimes the experimentation culture can clash with that idea, and it can be a resource drain in a different direction.
I 100% agree with that. The ideas are still reliant on human intuition, and revolutionary leaps like the one we talk about, like, horses to a car. I don't think you can experiment your way there. And the interesting bit here is that while we still rely on human intuition, these revolutionary leaps are far and few in between. I think the bit here is that there is so much optimization once you make the leap that is still available. And those are the ones that you would end up uncovering and discovering by experimentation, by way of experimentation. And when I mean experimentation, it's more like it all starts with measurement, because you need the measurement to understand if the direction you're taking is correct, and then be able to course correct it along the way. So take the car example, right? I mean, from 1914 all the way to now, we've had so much improvements, evolutionary improvements that have like actually resulted in revolutionary like changes over time. And a lot of that, there's many, many directions in which we have experimented with the cars and then decided not to, and then gone back to the drawing board and then like come back with some better ideas or better design. And those continue to exist. When I think about products, right, we've built product from scratch. On Marketplace, we built from scratch, from zero. Idea itself is not novel, but building it on top of like a social group was something new, and then we built it. That was entirely dependent on product intuition. And then we decided we're going to give it a shot. And then once one step worked, then we continued on to the next step. And when it didn't work, we went back to the drawing board. So yeah, we still continue to rely on intuition.
The process whereby you go from these kind of revolutions to the evolutions is so interesting to me, because I think my guess is that inside of large experimental cultures, you probably develop intuitions among teams where your wins maybe start getting smaller and smaller, more and more incremental. And maybe there's a consensus among the team where like, hey, we need to actually kind of blow up the landscape and go in search of bigger things. Is that true?
I think it depends on the company. Like you could say, we already found product market fit and we just want to drive, we want to drive variance in our process down to zero. This is like, if you're Toyota and you have a really good car, some of it is like adding new features to the car. Some of it is just making your process like incrementally better so that like you just drive out any defects. And that can be a sequence of tests and changes that you introduce carefully. And you can build a lot of value that way. I think it's just not a high growth strategy. Like we live in a world where like growth is the main way that people think of companies becoming more valuable, but they become valuable to people in other ways too. You could have the same number of users, but they're all a lot happier, or you drive your costs down in some way through a sequence of tests. And so like that can be a reasonable way to like be a business person. It's just that I think our culture is like growth at all costs. And that means like always have to search for the next big idea as part of your company's mission. It's
so interesting to me from the innovator's dilemma type situation where sometimes maybe you need a different set of people to think of a different type of idea, or you need a different context. You were talking about Toyota. Like, I think there are very good reasons why Toyota didn't build the first mainstream electric car.
Right.
And yet it looks very obvious in retrospect, but structurally that was not going to happen. So my guess is that along with this shift in, are you looking for these revolutions or these evolutions, it might actually mean things outside of like, do you use experiments or not? It's like, how do you structure your team and your process, and who do you have and all of this stuff?
Yeah, totally. 100% agree. Yeah, I think this is the reason why large companies, they do reorgs and bring in new talent, and you need the new ideas to be able to like try it out and have the ability to like actually give up on some of these existing ones. This is the innovator's dilemma. You want to be disrupting yourself. And sometimes the people that came up with the original idea get so attached to that idea that it's very hard for them to actually disrupt themselves. That's where new talent, new thinking, new leaders definitely helps.
Yeah, Elon Musk was an outsider in literally every single technology he ever built. And I think I read his book, and it was everyone thought that the electric car was never going to happen, sending rockets never going to happen, and you needed this like fresh mindset to not listen to the naysayers and bring true innovation to the market. I'd love to take it a little bit more back to reality, though. Experiments are hard. We've talked about that. They're not always successful. I think a lot of times we hear like, oh, inconclusive, or we need more data, or maybe there were confounding factors. And now you've like built a thing, you've tried it, you made this investment, and you've been left with a no answer or like inconclusive. When do experiments go poorly? What do those look like? And I'd love to hear like any stories of cautionary tales around experiments.
Oh man, I'm trying to think of good examples. It's hard. The most common way for an experiment to fail is that you get a inconclusive result and you don't know why. And so sort of like, that's the time when you failed to learn something, right? It's like there was just too much noise and you were unable to generate a large effect that you could measure. It's very common. I mean, people have a lot of inertia in products, and it's kind of amazing how difficult it is to change their behavior through changing products. I think I've been surprised by that at every turn, except for when I got to Lyft and I realized people are very sensitive to prices. So it was like, like 1 penny changes in prices would like reliably generate like massive changes in user behavior, but like, moving UI around or changing the design has been relatively ineffective. So I think like people just tend to pursue more incremental ideas as a way to fail, because you're playing it too safe, and so you end up not learning things. Then there's also the introducing problems and bugs that are subtle. And I have seen, cases where things interact poorly together, or implementation bugs and experiments that take a long time to learn, particularly with machine learning systems. So like you're switching from one machine learning system to another, and all kinds of subtle bugs can come up where like maybe one of the models isn't warned. So it needed like to run for a little longer to gather enough data to be effective. And so you can fail to learn because you just didn't run it for long enough. And so there's kind of like pathologies there. But good monitoring systems are really the best partner to an experimentation system. It's sort of like, you need to know that you're looking for outcomes that are generated by users using your product. But your process has to be controlled. Like all the things that you know about that you expect to happen need to be checked. And so if those things are failing, and it's not your user's fault, it's the fact that you didn't implement things correctly. That's the part where I think, careful engineering and having good monitoring and anomaly detection is a really strong complement, because it kind of like rules out these other sources of variation that are sort of not the thing that you're looking for in the experiment, but that can still change the results in a substantive way.
Yeah, I 100% agree with this. The monitoring and measurement is such a core discipline and important element to any change that you make to the product. And if you're not measuring it, and if you always are relying on a complete A/B test where you have to first come up with a hypothesis, then you have to build the variance out and then allocate samples, isolate the experiment, run it for several weeks, you're only going to look for the things that you're expecting to change. And so where if a system is automatically measuring every impact across the board, those are the ones that you're going to like identify side effects and then quickly realize what's going on. I do have a couple stories though. So it's kind of, when, one of this is, what you measure actually may be different, for different countries, cultures, and so on and so forth. And so we've had some pretty interesting, stories. So one, about Marketplace, where, when we were building Marketplace, one of the biggest considerations was safety, trust and safety. When people meet up together to exchange products, and how do we, make that very safe. And so we would like provide options for meetup where it's kind of like the right time and where we know that there's a large crowd. And then we experimented our way, built various different products, and then tested the hypothesis and validated it. And then when we launched Marketplace in India, all of that went out the door, because there was an element of like, people don't want to meet anywhere. It doesn't matter where. And then we kind of like kept building more and more of these experiments, trying out, continued to fail. And then when we actually sent our research team to sit down and talk to some of the folks, why would they not go meet up? People we realized there's a cultural element to it, that they would rather have someone deliver the items than go meet up in person, and then actually use some form of a digital payment versus like actually pay cash on Meetup. So those are kind of things that we would not have uncovered with Experiment. We had to actually do some user research to identify. So that was a pretty interesting takeaway from like, just continuing to experiment and assuming the experiment results from one country or culture actually applies to everywhere.
You made me think of another good example of failure of interpretation comes up a lot where, like you measure the effect, but there's like these variables that you're not measuring that, the unanticipated changes. And one mechanism for that's quite interesting happens at places like Facebook and Lyft are these spillovers. So like a big assumption of experiments is that each individual observation doesn't affect the other ones. And at Lyft, we would run these like driver randomizations. So some drivers would get some incentives and some wouldn't. And we'd say, hey, they drove more hours because we gave them these incentives. Great. But they were just stealing rides from other drivers. So actually the net effect of that on the whole system was actually like, zero. And we're just spending money to give some drivers hours and disincentivize other drivers from driving. And so these kind of like spillover effects are very common in social platforms like Facebook and places like marketplace companies. And they're very, very challenging to deal with. And those experiments are ones where like people come to you and they say, I have a win. Look at this great effect that I got. And you have to think very critically about like, okay, well, what are the other ways that we're not accounting for the costs of this? And then, okay, like you add it up and then, okay, the costs, or we do the right experiment with the right unit of analysis, we get a completely different result. And that's where it gets dangerous because people think of experiments as this gold standard. I can look at this number and I trust it 100%. And it's actually not trustworthy because it has its own assumptions baked into it.
I know that this is going to sound very basic and almost not worth talking about, but I think that many folks have not actually seen what it looks like to interact with one of these experimentation tools. And we've talked about this a little bit. If, Vijay, you were saying before, if every single time you're kind of setting up your A/B test and these tools, everything's kind of already set up and you're specifically identifying the groups of humans and I think the metrics that you're tracking for that experiment, or not every experiment is going to have the same set of metrics, right?
Yeah. Where I was going with this is the A/B testing, traditionally, the way we have done it is actually time consuming manual. There's a lot of manual input that goes in, including the hypothesis, including the variance that you build. Where, what Facebook had and what we're building at Statsig is the ability for you to like assign, here are some core metrics that we care about in the business. And these are, not the individual shallow metrics that you're like expecting to change with an experiment, but actual metrics that you care about.
Like revenue.
Yeah, revenue, engagement, retention, the core metrics that a business cares about. And then the ability to automatically have the tool tell you when I change a feature or I ship a feature. Because if you think about it, every feature actually has a hypothesis baked in. Why would you build a feature? You're building a feature because you think it's good for your users or your customers, or maybe it's good for your business. One of those things is valid. But oftentimes we ship features without ever turning that into an experiment or actually validating, is that feature actually doing what I'm expecting it to do? Are there any side effects? Are there things that I am, when Sean was talking about, are there, macro impact, or basically the macro is basically zero and I spent all this effort building this thing only to move some individual metric inside. So those are the kinds of things that is extremely important to like track. And if the tools can do that work for you, you can run 20 experiments in a month. So not a problem at all.
Thank you for that. The reason that I wanted to dig into that is because I think that many folks in the industry, and I think that my original exposure to experimentation too was via a small set of vendors in the early 2010s, let's say. It was like a very hot category for new startups, and it kind of like went around the world. Everyone was like really excited about this new capability. You embed a JavaScript tracker and you've got a line on a page, and you're like, well, if the line gets up high enough, then you say you're good to go and you launch the thing. And I was getting exposed via this mechanism, and I did some experimentation like that at my last company. And then I went to Etsy. This is like 2013, 2014. And I saw their experimentation tool, and everything was like served from the warehouse. They were using Vertica at the time, and their web analytics was in there. All of their business metrics were in there, and that you would just select an experiment and a freaking dashboard would show up, and it would be like, here's everything that you need to know. And I was just blown away. I was like, this is not the same thing. And I don't think that most people even are aware that that is possible. And that's the world that like many folks live in.
Yeah, I agree. And a lot of times those A/B tests, when we're moving things around on a web page, they're also measuring a very shallow metric. So sometimes when you say, okay, I changed this button or the button text and I'm getting more clicks, but did it really move your business metrics? And there's no way to even understand that. So the more sophisticated tools will be able to like actually track impact to your core metrics, and not just one or two features, but across the board. Every single code change that you make is measured, and then you get a report.
Yeah, the platforms are amazing. I mean, I worked at 2 companies with really mature platforms, and it's such a value add to the company, not just because individually I can look at an experiment and see what the results are, but it collects organizational knowledge about all the tests that have been run. That you have this sort of like track record of all the things that you tried, what effects that they generated, what trade-offs that you're making is a really interesting plot to make. So sort of like when we have a positive effect on this metric, we tend to also have a negative effect on this other metric. Is only something that you can do when you have many experiments and you can do these kinds of meta-analyses. And and then also what decisions that you made based on that tells you a lot about your organization. So you look at like which of the experiments actually got launched, which is something that we never logged at Facebook, but we were able to start a project at Lyft where we started logging the launch decisions from all the experiments. So we had this kind of like plot of like, what are we actually valuing as an organization empirically is revealed by what tests that you tend to ship. And so like which metrics matter the most for shipping, especially in a large organization where you don't really have control over what gets shipped. You can kind of see what got launched, and it tells you a really nice story about how you're valuing things.
Yeah, the one of the very cool views that I love is the ability to pick a metric. If you were the CEO and you cared about revenue, and you pick the revenue metric, and then you get a list of all the features that are positively impacting that metric and the features that are negatively impacting that metric. That is such an important view, because that tells you which teams or which projects you want to double down on, which teams you want to wind down.
Totally. There's a lot of changes that have happened in experimentation over the last decade, and I'm super excited to see more of that great tooling and technology come to smaller companies, because as a confession, as a product manager, I don't think I've ever run an experiment that either of you would deem acceptable. but hopefully we'll get there. But I'm going to wrap up. This has been a fun episode. We ask this to all our guests, but looking 10 years out, what do you hope will be true for the data industry? Vijay, why don't we start with you?
When I look at tools like Datadog, and you see this data observability and then this modern data stack, what they're doing to data is just incredible. So let me give you a systems view of it. I could today tell which one of the servers among thousands of servers that we run is running out of memory in real time. And then I go to the product world, and then I'm like, okay, what did we ship? We shipped a version to the App Store 2 weeks ago. How are the metrics doing? They're doing this, and why are they doing this way? And then you have to have someone go debug as to what caused this metric to go up or down. And this whole process is so manual, and it's not real time. And so 10 years down the line, I hope that we will get to a place where products are also caught up to where the systems observability is, where people are able to understand how the products are benefiting users on a more granular level in a more real time. So that would be my ideal case.
It's a good answer. Mine kind of dovetails with that. I think that we have spent a long time as a data community focused on infrastructure and reliability. Sort of like how do we do the thing we're already doing, but make it scalable and reliable so that we don't have defects in what we're doing. I don't want to show people numbers that aren't correct. But I think that the aspect that we've been missing is the feedback loop with humans has gotten slower, because we're creating a lot of batch processing type ideas. We're just we're just going to create this really reliable process, but it creates a slow feedback loop for people. And I think the human factors in data analysis are really all about how quickly someone can learn what they need to learn. And we do need reliable data to do that. And I'm glad that we're making those investments. But my thesis is that the bottleneck is now at the point where how fast can people interact with the system and get the insights that they need. And I think we've underinvested there. And that's really a design and human computer interface kind of problem. It's what I'm most interested in these days is assume we solve all the data quality and infrastructure problems. What's next? It's the bottleneck of how do we get the information to people's brains?
I love that. At my last company, I was very focused on learning rate. I called it IQRT, interactive query response time. It was like all the things that you had to go through the process of like asking a new question and like loading the resulting information into your brain.
Right.
It's like the whole ecosystem is working on improving that. Thanks. This has been tremendously fun. Really appreciated everything that you shared.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us. This is great.
The Analytics Engineering Podcast is sponsored by DBT Labs and is hosted by Tristan Handy and myself, Julia Schottenstein. Have comments, questions, or guest suggestions? Email us at podcast@dbtlabs.com. Our producers are Jeff Fox and David Krevitt. If you enjoy the show, please drop a review or share it with a friend. Thanks for listening.